This is the third session or lecture on Christian peacemaking in the 21st century. And what we want to look at today are some of the challenges that could provoke war where nations may not necessarily want one. And we want to also look at the developments in the last, say, 40 years or so, which has created both hope and, excuse me, um, challenges to the modern age when it comes to these weapons. Now, one of the things I think that's important to remember is the Catholic Church in the Second Vatican Council in 1965 published a document called the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World. It is often referred to as Gaudium et Spes, and this was in 1965. The point of the document was to talk about how the Church could be engaged with the problems facing humanity. The church as the servant church, the church as one that seeks to heal wounds, to offer forgiveness, and to help to reshape a world that is more befitting of human beings. And so this became a deep concern for the Council Fathers, and in this particular document, which is actually, when you look at the council documents, was actually the longest of all of them, including longer than the pastoral constitution, excuse me, the dogmatic constitution on the church. So it's really kind of a remarkable document because it becomes sort of the charter of people who are deeply concerned about the shape of the world as Roman Catholics. What do we do? So the bishops at the council put together this rather extraordinary document. And of course, Pope Paul VI approved it, so it's become official church teaching. He say that peace is not merely the absence of war, nor can it be reduced solely to the maintenance of a balance of power between enemies. Nor is it brought about by dictatorship. Instead, it is richly and appropriately called an enterprise of justice. Peace results from that harmony built into the human society by its divine founder and actualized by men as they thirst after ever greater justice. Well, they simply didn't mean just men, but they were not discussing sexist language. As a culture, we weren't even doing it at the time. We could certainly say by human beings, obviously. But that does get us to something which is extremely important, that no real sense of peace. Peace is not merely the absence of open conflict in war, but it's the presence of justice. It is the treating of each human being as precious, each human being having dignity that must be respected. Hence, we create societies where people have access to the things that allow a humane existence to be: food, clothing, health care, education, employment, a living wage, things of that nature that by divine right human beings are entitled to. And that's something which we know as a world we're still struggling with. And as a consequence, of course, when people do not have these items or when they feel insecure, more than likely some level of conflict will occur because already there's violence being done to people. It may not be people shooting at them, but just the sheer conditions in which they live can be a violent thing as well. So, the U.S. Catholic bishops in 1983 published a letter called The Challenge of Peace, God's Promise and Our Response. Now, they were doing this in the context of what was going on in the early 80s. In 1979, then President Carter published Presidential Directive 59. And that directive said that the United States should prepare its nuclear forces to fight protracted, limited, and if need be, general nuclear war with the object of prevailing in such a war. Well, that's certainly a very tall order. Prevailing in a nuclear war is rather one of the most foggy definitions of victory one could possibly imagine. No one could figure out what exactly prevailing meant. Do we have two people left versus one person? It was alarming because both sides were going forward with weapons development that would be far more destructive and accurate than they've ever been. And of course, accuracy is the main thing. Both sides were developing the capability to strike at each other's missiles in silo And that could be considered very dangerous because during a crisis situation, one side may be faced with the term of use them or lose them. And nuclear weapons, even today, are still on a 15-minute hair trigger alert status, which really does not really reflect the political situation going on today. Yes, there are some level of tensions, but nothing even remotely resembling what was then the Cold War. But the bishops looked at this, and it was clear that people were becoming alarmed. In 1982, almost 1 million people marched in New York City, calling an end to the arms race, and around the world, in Europe and other places, this was going on as well. And this is in a context where the United States was planning to deploy to NATO new cruise missiles and Pershing II missiles. The Soviet Union did not want that, obviously. They thought it could be somewhat destabilizing. They themselves had deployed the SS-20 missile, which NATO felt was a threat to their existence. And so you can see the kind of bind that the superpowers were in at the time. Many people in Europe were protesting the Pershing II and the cruise missiles because they were felt to be, by many, first strike weapons that would be used to more or less strike first in a nuclear war. The Soviet Union viewed those as fairly destabilizing weapons. And so they wanted to more or less stop NATO from deploying. Eventually, the bishops looked at this and said, people are certainly scared. And then in 1983, a movie came out called The Day After, which dramatized what a nuclear war would look like. What would the aftermath be like? Well, of course, TV is never going to be able to capture the full extent of the mayhem and horror of what such a war would be like. But it did give people at least a visual. It did wake up a lot of people to say, oh, this is dangerous. We need to deal with this now instead of postponing dealing with this. So the U.S. bishops more or less took this on. And when they published their letter, they had this to say: faith does not insulate us from the daily challenges of life, but intensifies our desire to address them precisely in the light of the gospel, which has come to us in the person of the risen Christ. Through the resources of faith and reason, we desire in this letter to provide hope for people in our day and direction toward a world freed of the nuclear threat. So clearly the bishops were staking their claim here that we need to begin again to speak of this nuclear question in the context of moral reasoning and the reasoning of our Catholic and Christian traditions. One of the challenges that has come up in the nuclear age are accidents. These are accidents where weapons could have been detonated, some have been lost, some missiles have blown up. One missile blew up in its silo. Fortunately, the warhead didn't detonate and so forth. But we begin to see that, in the nuclear age, there have been a number of accidents and lost nukes, what's called broken arrows. In 1961, for instance, the nuclear warfighting plan had called for the destruction of the USSR, China, and the Warsaw Pact countries of Eastern Europe, which would have resulted in 600 million prompt fatalities, not including retaliation against the United States. The world would be, of course, no more since, as we learned in the 1980s, research showed that nuclear winter would be the result using only 400 of what at that time, in 1961, 30,000 nuclear weapons were on Earth. So the probability of a nuclear winter after such a devastating attack was, of course, a given. And so there's a serious question whether or not really any animal life at all would remain alive on the earth. I remember this precipitated, this type of thinking precipitated a book that came out in, I believe it was around 1979, by Jonathan Schell called Fate of the Earth, where he talked about what if a full-scale nuclear war did happen, what would happen to the earth. That certainly raised a lot of eyebrows and got people thinking very seriously about the consequences of such a war. Now, the probability of nuclear war is low, except when an international crisis occurs. Many believe, of course, that no nation would initiate such a war knowing the outcome was certain destruction on themselves, as well as pretty much everybody else. But it still doesn't raise the, it still doesn't really answer the question about accidents. What about these accidents? Nobody really wants a nuclear war, obviously, but sometimes we get something we don't want, chiefly because we can't control all the variables in play. Now, on July 28th, in 1957, in the Atlantic Ocean, two weapons jettisoned were not recovered. You know, a U.S. Air Force, as you see, C-124 aircraft from Dover, Delaware, was carrying 3 nuclear bombs over the Atlantic Ocean when it experienced a loss of power. The crew jettisoned 2 nuclear bombs to protect their safety, which were never recovered. So they're lying at the bottom of the sea somewhere. Hopefully, the firing circuits by now have been corroded by seawater so that the bomb won't detonate. It's not easy to detonate a nuclear weapon. They are usually, there's an elaborate kind of computer programming on board that will only allow certain things that would allow the weapon to detonate. There are several safety features included and so forth. Of course, safety features don't give you a guarantee, but they certainly are a hedge on your bets. There were bombs dropped accidentally out of a plane over North Carolina. There were 8 safety switches on it. 7 of the switches failed. Only 1 worked. That one switch prevented a 3 megaton explosion on the soil of the state of North Carolina. Now, a 3 megaton explosion is bound to ruin your day. It would have ruined the day for millions of people in that state, and depending upon the pattern of the wind, the fallout from it could have gone all the way up the eastern seaboard. Now, the cause of, you have another one called the Uss Scorpion, and I remember this as a kid, that this simply disappeared. It sank well en route from Spain to the naval base in Norfolk, Virginia. The cause of the sinking was unknown. There were 99 officers and men aboard who simply were killed. The wreckage of the ship, the reactor, which was nuclear, and nuclear torpedoes. No one knows where they are. Okay. On June 3rd, in 1980, at 3 a.m., National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski was awakened by a call from his military assistant. He was told that NORAD computers were reporting that 2,200 Soviet missiles had been launched against the United States. According to Brzezinski, just 1 minute before he planned to call President Jimmy Carter to recommend an immediate U.S. nuclear retaliatory response, word came through that NORAD message was a false alarm caused by software simulating a Soviet missile attack that was inexplicably transferred into the live warning system at the command's headquarters. So evidently this accident was triggered by simply a computer error. You know, we've had like little chips burn out in the computer which have issued warnings, which certainly have created a lot of panic and frustration until they were found out. On 26th of September in 1983, the nuclear early warning system of the Soviet Union reported the launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile with 4 missiles behind it from bases in the United States. These missile warnings were suspected to be a false alarm by Stanislav Petrov, an officer of the Soviet Air Defense Forces on duty at the command center. None of these, of course, actually arrived. Rather than immediately relaying the warning up the chain of command, this decision is seen as having prevented a retaliatory nuclear attack against the United States and its NATO allies, which would likely have resulted in an escalation to a full-scale nuclear war. Investigation of the satellite warning system later determined that the system had indeed malfunctioned, that it was simply based upon how the moon was rising over the horizon, and it fooled the sensors and the satellites that were detecting or supposedly detecting a missile launch. Now, we have to give kudos to Stanislav Petrov. He was awarded an award by the United Nations as the man, who saved the world. It was a time of high tension. The Soviet Union and the United States weren't talking to each other. In that same year, the Soviet Union had shot down a Korean airliner, mistaking it for a U.S. spy plane flying close into its airspace. The president had talked about the end of the world at an evangelical conference that same year. He had been on the radio and someone left the mic open and he talked about solving the Soviet problem by bombing in 5 minutes. And the rhetoric was extremely bellicose at the time. NATO at the time was conducting war games that was based on an actual nuclear attack. They had not mobilized troops. It was merely radio traffic. But everything that was going on scared the Soviet Union. They were convinced that with the United States deploying new missiles in Europe, that these would give them the drop on the Soviet Union and they would need to strike first if something went wrong. It wasn't until all this was found out that President Ronald Reagan began to understand that the Soviet Union was extremely frightened of the United States, that they would launch a nuclear war. And perhaps the silver lining in this is he began to rethink his strategy as to how to deal with the Soviet Union. Ultimately, when the Soviet Union moved Mikhail Gorbachev to General Secretary of the Communist Party, Gorbachev was interested in negotiation and ending the Cold War just as Ronald Reagan was. Ronald Reagan, of course, though he came in with a rather bellicose talk about war and so on and so forth, he did not like nuclear weapons. In fact, he was an abolitionist. He wanted to get rid of all of them, which, as you know, is a very complex type of thing, which we'll look at. But it was kind of interesting how these certain experiences began to wake a few people up. We can only be thankful and offer a prayer and thanks for Stanislav Petrov, who did not pass the orders up the chain of command at a time when this could have really triggered a war, obviously, that no one would want. False alarm in 1995, I mean, these are just samplings of a vast array of accidents and false alarms and so forth. A Norwegian rocket known as the Black Brant scare occurred on January 25th, 1995, when a team of Norwegian and U.S. scientists launched a Black Brant 12 four-stage sounding rocket from the Adola rocket range off the northwestern coast of Norway. The rocket carried scientific equipment to study the aurora borealis. It flew on a high northbound trajectory, which included an air corridor that stretches from Minuteman III nuclear missile silos in North Dakota all the way to the Russian capital city of Moscow. The rocket eventually reached an altitude of 1,453 kilometers, or 903 miles, resembling a U.S. Navy submarine-launched Trident missile. Russian nuclear forces were put on high alert as a result, fearing a high-altitude nuclear attack that could blind Russian radar, and Russia's nuclear briefcase was brought to Russian President Boris Yeltsin, who then had to decide whether to launch a retaliatory nuclear strike against the United States. Of course, with 3 minutes remaining before he had to launch, they finally found out that, in fact, it was not a Trident missile submarine. 3 minutes, 180 seconds was the difference between nuclear war and not. And this is really striking, since by 1995 the Cold War had ended. The United States and Russia now were working closer together on some things, trying to create a more secure world. But it still goes to show you that so long as these weapons exist, there's going to be fears. Unnecessary fears, of course, of some sort of similar thing occurring. And that is one of the chief concerns about, as peacemakers, that these weapons still remain, aside from the fact that they are evil in their intent, clearly. They're simply too dangerous. An accident with these weapons will destroy cities and sometimes nations, as Robert McNamara once said. So we need to think about how we can move away from these particular weapons and ultimately point toward their elimination, which in many ways sounds rather utopian, but if we can't imagine that it's possible, it will never happen. So we need to continually talk to each other, negotiate through things, and help create a different situation. One of the most challenging incidents that occurred was known as the Damascus Incident. Now, this occurred early in the morning on a Friday, September 19, two men who were more or less, they had gone there to do routine maintenance on it, entered the silo. And one of the things that had happened is, as they were working, one of them dropped a wrench, and it fell far enough and it ruptured the skin of the missile where the fuel was stored. And two other guys came in with vapor detectors, and it indicated that there was a possible explosion that could occur, and so they evacuated people out of there. The team then ordered to re-enter the silo to turn on an exhaust fan. When they re-entered the silo to carry out the order, by 3 a.m. there was what they call hypergolic fuel exploded, likely due to arching in the exhaust fan, some kind of current. The initial explosion catapulted the 740-ton silo door away from the silo and ejected the second stage and the nuclear warhead. Once clear of the silo, the second stage exploded, but the W-53 warhead landed about 100 feet from the launch complex's entry gate. Its safety features had prevented the loss of the radioactive material, as well as preventing a nuclear detonation. Now, the warhead on top of that missile was a 9-megaton weapon. 9 megatons would have taken out immediately almost half of Arkansas, not to mention the radioactive and thermal effects and the destructive explosive effects, the overpressures, would have destroyed millions of lives and would have been a catastrophe for the United States. Now, had this been closer to a major urban area like New York City or Chicago, one can only imagine the results. Millions of people would have died. And it really raised the concern about safety. These missiles were soon after taken out of the U.S. inventory. They simply were too unstable. The weapon systems no longer were required, as the United States and the Soviet Union, by the time we reach 1988, had begun to disarm some of their systems with the INF Treaty, where they eliminated the missiles in Europe, both sides, and then eventually with START 1, START 2, START 3, and New START. These were all nuclear weapons treaties between them to reduce their strategic forces, that is, the forces that could hit an adversary's homeland. Okay, we did that one, so let's go on. One of the challenges for us in this age, and since 1945, well, really we could say, I guess you could say 1949, when the Soviet Union detonated its first nuclear weapon, that nations have not since 1945 used nuclear weapons as a weapon in war since 1945. They've used them, but they've generally used them in terms of either veiled threats or actually nuclear threats against other nations. You'll see things at times when nuclear bombers are moved closer to an adversary's homeland as sort of a nuclear signal that we're very displeased with certain developments and you need to be careful so that you don't unleash an American nuclear response. These types of nuclear blackmail or nuclear chicken, or what Paul Bracken calls nuclear mind games. Dr. Bracken teaches at Yale University and is often consulted on these matters of deterrence and nuclear warfighting by the Pentagon and actually by other foreign leaders as well. What can we do to make things safer? What are the dangers and so forth? So he talks about this sort of nuclear head games where people would make these veiled threats or often overt threats to prevent nations from doing certain things. Of course, after the USSR develops these weapons, we have a new concept called nuclear deterrence. Deterrence means that nations are deterred from using these weapons on another nuclear power because of an unacceptable revenge. Not only that, but nations are often deterred from using these weapons on the allies of other major powers because this could trigger, obviously, a nuclear response from the other major power. And people take care of their allies, and NATO, of course, is a great alliance in the West. And for the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, which consisted of many of the countries of Eastern Europe. These great nations would defend these NATO and the Warsaw Pact with their own weapons. So attacking one member of those alliances meant an attack on the entire alliance, which would have precipitated, obviously, a nuclear war. Now, no responsible leader really wants or would consider risking one of their own cities for the city of another. The costs and risks of further escalation are just simply too dangerous. And, most national leaders are rational enough to understand these costs and risks. So as a consequence, all the nuclear powers have a vested interest in what they call crisis stability. That is, that the forces are structured in such a way that neither side would have advantage or incentive to strike first during an international crisis. It is simply the cost would be too high and the benefits would be non-existent, pretty much. That's what we call crisis stability. But when you introduce new weapons into the mix, or weapons that are perceived as having a strong offensive capability, where one side seems to have advantage, it begins to destabilize the situation, and it creates a worst-case thinking by many. It creates the fear that a nation could strike in a certain situation, and so nations might be preempted rather than waiting to be hit, decide to hit first. And this creates an unstable situation, so arms control generally has been focused in on reducing instability to create such a situation where no one has an advantage of going first. There are threats, of course, to stable deterrence. Terrorists getting the bomb are a deep threat. They're not deterred by consequences if they're willing to die for their cause. Also, how would someone decide who was to blame if no one takes responsibility for the act? So this is one of the nightmare scenarios of the major nuclear powers or any major power. A terrorist gets a hold of a bomb, they destroy a city, and then they say, we have 5 more, and if you don't accede to our demands, we're going to begin detonating these weapons all around your country. This, of course, would be the nightmare scenario. At this point, we know that terrorist groups have been working to get the bomb, trying to steal the nuclear material or to buy it, and so forth. To this date, we have been fortunate that no such act has occurred, because countries have a vested interest in terrorists not getting the bomb, they tend to work together to prevent that from occurring. Of course, one of the dangers, too, is the terrorist lights up a city with a bomb and they start saying, well, we are working for X country, or we did this at the behest of this country. That could trigger a war between nuclear powers. So it's considered one of the real threats to stable deterrence. The deployment of weapons and delivery systems, as I noted before, that are planned to be deployed or could erode stable deterrence. Stealth bombers, hypersonic missiles, cyber war capabilities, anti-satellite capability, warfighting doctrines, the accuracy of weapons, and so on and so forth, could be destabilizing to deterrence. And it often forces the other side to respond by building either a counter weapon or something similar. Of course, you can see that with hypersonic missiles, you reduce reaction time. Especially during a crisis, this can be very destabilizing because world leaders would be faced with split-second timing in their decision-making, and they may be getting false alarms. So they might actually initiate a war that doesn't need to be initiated. Okay? Deterrence, of course, is immoral. Normal moral thinking, certainly in Christianity, one cannot threaten to do evil. That is evil in itself. The U.S. Catholic bishops in 1983 were following up on the words of Pope John Paul II that they would be willing to tolerate the existence of deterrence with some sort of moral provisional acceptance, so long as the major powers were working to eliminate nuclear weapons. So we could say since 1980, there were 70,000 nuclear weapons on the planet. Today, there are about 13,000. So we can see that there have been good faith efforts to reduce these weapons. But one of the concerns of today is all the nuclear powers are modernizing their forces. And we know that new variables are in play that weren't in play during the Cold War. As we enter the second nuclear age, we have more players in the game. We have advanced technologies beginning to enter, and we're also beginning to entertain the possibility of using artificial intelligence in terms of our weapon systems, which would take much of the decision making out of the hands of human beings. Cyber war capabilities, the fear is that another nation could hack, or terrorists could hack, the nuclear weapons programs or the nuclear weapons facilities themselves to either detonate the warheads or to, in some fashion or another, initiate a missile launch that wasn't, ordered by the president, and so forth. So we're entering into a much more challenging time of many more, more players, unpredictability. Some of the players, like India and Pakistan, had fought conventional wars, at least three major ones, since the end of the Second World War. Both are nuclear armed and both border each other. So this is the first time we really had this kind of scenario. We know that Iran is working on developing nuclear weapons, and of course the state of Israel that lives in that neighborhood is deeply concerned about this, and as we recently found out, assassinated one of the major nuclear scientists of Iran in last fall. So we can see that this particular situation is developing in such a way that obviously we need to look closely at these developments and do what we can to curtail nations' almost addiction to believing that more weapons means more security. Now, of course, one of the real tricky things is why do nations go to war in the first place? These are just some things that seem to trigger military hostilities of nation against nation. For some, the present situation is unbearable and unjust. Nations who feel they are being treated unfairly or at disadvantage will try to change the status quo. They'll look at the cost and benefit of doing something or taking some type of action. If they feel that the cost is bearable and that the outcome certainly would be more favorable to them, the chance of risk-taking going to war is elevated, obviously. Sometimes going to war has the advantage of deflecting domestic unrest, rallying the population to deal with an enemy rather than the incompetence of the present domestic situation and political powers of the day. We saw such an example in the Falklands War in 1982 when the Argentine junta of generals, the economy was simply in the tank, hyperinflation, loss of jobs, and to deflect their incompetence, or the people looking at their incompetence, they started a war by taking over what they called the Malvinas Islands, which at that time was a British possession. And the British felt compelled to take them back, and so you had the Falklands War. Preventive war, that is, to eliminate the threat to one's own nation. Nations may look at a possible adversary and say their particular deployments of weapon systems, their military posturing, is becoming very dangerous to us. And before they get as strong as or stronger than us, maybe we ought to simply fight a preventive war so they cannot pose a danger in the future. This has been toyed with from time to time in the nuclear age. Certainly the United States, while there were plans drawn up for just such a war, Eisenhower rejected it. He felt that America should not use these weapons in a preventive war, but he also felt, of course, this worked against the grain of the American character. And he also knew this is very dangerous and immoral thinking. You want the United States to go down in history as a nation which butchers innocent men, women, and children. Of course, there's this sense of the perception of danger and threat that fuels arms races. We saw this before the First World War, when Great Britain deployed the Dreadnought, the first Dreadnought battleship, which was, 2.5 times had the firepower of any battleship on the seas. It triggered a naval arms race and was one of the contributing factors to the perception of danger and threat, which ultimately led to the First World War. Did it cause the First World War? No. But it certainly put people in the frame of mind of this sort of perception of danger. So it was one of the causative factors, though it wasn't the only factor, obviously. Revenge for historical humiliations. This has occurred. World War II came right off the back of World War I. Germany felt humiliated, betrayed. They were suffering from hyperinflation, large-scale unemployment, complete social chaos, and a strong man like Hitler came along, and the temptation to give themselves over to this man led to the Second World War, the Holocaust, and all this particular thing chiefly because, in many ways, they felt that they had been humiliated, that their whole country was in a shambles, and they needed somebody to blame. And Hitler gave them back a strong military, gave them back some of their land that they had lost in the First World War, and tried to more or less divest the Germans of the shame of the Versailles Treaty. The ambitions of the heads of state are powerful groups. You get powerful groups in a nation or a head of state who has ambitions to expand the borders of the nation, to get important natural resources or historical claims on certain land masses and so forth, have been contributors to war. The accumulation of wealth and power in some nations may give them the temptation to use that to more or less press their will against other nations. The security dilemma that creates a perception of danger, which fuels attitudes, people with fear, like, that creates the sense of the missile gap or the window of vulnerability. The security dilemma basically says this, that every nation is in the self-defense business, that you can't rely on alliances to protect you. You have to defend yourself. And so what you do is you create the military forces and the structure of those forces to answer your security needs. The difficulty, of course, with that is other nations see what you're doing. And then they may see this as aggressive in nature, and they will, of course, respond with building their forces to respond. And this particular cycle continues, it's sort of an action-reaction cycle, creating the perception of fear. As political realists will often talk about, the international relations among nations is a state of war, or at least potential war. And so all nations have to be armed to defend themselves. And so this escaping the security dilemma seems to be an impossibility. Well, in the way the current nation state is established, in the way that we've dealt with things at this point, it probably does hold true. That doesn't mean that has to be the future, obviously. We can construct different ways of nations relating to each other little by little. It's probably not going to happen right away. It's sort of like a fullback who gains first downs 3 yards here, 4 yards there, just keep moving the ball up the field. Very rarely does revolutions in international relations take place by throwing the long one, and it means that therefore peacemaking has to be based, at least in a Christian context, on a deep spirituality, a spirituality that wants peace, is willing to do whatever it can to build peace in the world, recognizing that the work will continue after we've shuffled off this mortal coil and gone home to the Lord. Other people will pick up the mantle. The other reasons why nations may go to war is bad or non-existent communication with other nations who are competitors. When you break down communication, that generates worst-case thinking, so that nations will be looking at what another nation does, usually with a very jaundiced eye, thinking that they're aggressive in intent and will precipitate tensions between others in such a way where it may merely be a mirage, but no one can see through the mirage because of perception. Unresolved tensions and injustices which create the desire to strike back. For instance, that's why terrorists do what they do. This deep sense of injustice, being mistreated by other nations, being taken advantage of them. The one option a terrorist has is to strike at the soft underbelly of other countries, which is usually their civilian population. The lack of empathy and the failure to tend to unforeseen consequences. The lack of empathy between nations usually results in us not truly understanding the intent of another, or that is, not seeing the world through their eyes, and so policies can often go into directions we don't want them to go. For instance, during the first Persian Gulf War in 1991, someone asked the Indian defense minister what had the world learned about the war, and his response was, if you're going to take on the United States, you're going to have nuclear weapons. Now, that was clearly not the intent of the United States in driving Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. But that was the message some people got. And so often this lack of empathy, of being able to understand how people will often interpret the actions of another, can lead to unforeseen consequences and hence developments that actually later on become more dangerous than the original problems. That the benefits outweigh the costs. Nations will go to war if they think they can get something out of it, combined, of course, with other issues. Accident, miscalculation, and madness are possibilities. Certainly in the nuclear age, we know that accidents have occurred. Miscalculation of an adversary's actions or what they will do almost led the Cuban Missile Crisis to turn into a full-scale nuclear war. And, of course, madness. Normally speaking, most nuclear powers have pretty clear chains of command, and only a few people have release authority with nuclear weapons. But we also know that you get somebody who's got control, like the President of the United States. At this point, there's nothing to prevent the President from initiating nuclear war. He really doesn't need the approval of anybody else. He's the one who orders a nuclear strike. So we could ask the question, is it really a good thing that one person in a particular nation who could have the capacity in some scenarios to launch a war? And that has, of course, generated great discussion. We also see that discussion very clearly in a recent book called The Button, basically presidential authority over nuclear weapons from the time of Truman and to the time of our former president, Donald Trump. But this is still an issue today. Who should we allow to have release authority on these weapons? Should it just be the president, or does there have to be a team of other people involved? So these are kind of the questions that are posed, why and how nations could go to war, how wars can get started, sometimes simply by accident or by miscalculation, and what is the situation we face. In our next segment, we'll look at the biblical themes that allow us as Christian peacemakers to draw on a spirituality for peacemaking. In the meantime, I want everyone to do well, stay safe,